fire doesn't read a probability model. That's the thing nobody who hasn't stood in front of a wind-driven crown fire ever quite understands from a briefing room. A fire behaves the way the fuel, the terrain, and the wind tell it to behave, in a language that's mostly consistent and occasionally, catastrophically, not, the rare afternoon where every variable lines up in exactly the wrong combination, and a fire that was spreading at a manageable pace for 6 hours suddenly triples its rate of spread in 20 minutes, faster than any evacuation plan built on the morning's numbers can account for. My name is Desmond Ashby. I spent 38 years with the Forest Service, the last 22 as a fire behavior analyst, called out to nearly every major incident in this region to read exactly that language for incident commanders who needed to know, in real time, whether a fire was about to do something the morning's model hadn't predicted. This is a story about the week I discovered that the model failing to predict it wasn't entirely the model's fault. It was mine, decades earlier, in a way I'd never once considered until it very nearly cost a town everything. My niece Rosalind, Roz, to everyone who's known her since she was a kid trailing after me at agency picnics, joined the Forest Service's newly formed Fire Analytics Division 4 years ago, after a data science degree and a brief stint at a climate modeling startup that had, by her own account, left her wanting to work on something with more immediate human stakes than long-range emissions projections. She was smart in the specific way her mother, my younger sister, had always been smart, and I watched her build a genuine expertise in fire behavior modeling faster than I'd have expected from someone without a single season of actual fireline experience. The system she helped build, EmberTrace, used 40 years of historical fire incident data, spread rates, fuel moisture readings, wind patterns, terrain slope, and outcome records from thousands of documented fires, to generate real-time spread predictions for active incidents, feeding continuously updated weather and satellite data into a model trained to forecast where a fire would be in 6, 12, and 24 hours. It was, by any reasonable measure, the most sophisticated fire behavior prediction tool this agency had ever deployed, and in its first 2 full fire seasons, it had proven remarkably accurate across the overwhelming majority of incidents it was tested against. EmberTrace isn't trying to replace what you do, Uncle Des, Roz told me, in the spring before this story's events, sitting at my kitchen table the way she had 100 times growing up, except now with a laptop open between us instead of a school project. It's trying to give incident commanders 40 years of pattern recognition instantly, instead of relying entirely on whichever analyst happens to have personally seen a similar fire before. 40 years of data's only as good as what actually got written down in those 40 years, Roz. I've filed enough incident reports in my career to know how much gets rounded off, simplified, or left out entirely, because the form only has so many boxes and the fire doesn't wait for you to invent a new one. I said that as a general, professional caution, the kind of thing I'd said in agency meetings for years about any new predictive tool built on historical records. I had no idea, saying it that afternoon at my own kitchen table, how personally that caution was about to apply to me specifically, rather than to the abstract category of imperfect data collection I'd spent a career gesturing at without ever examining my own contribution to it. Roz laughed a little at the time, the way she used to laugh at my old man's skepticism about anything with a screen attached to it, and told me the model's validation team had already run extensive backtesting against known historical outcomes with strong results. I believed her, and I had no particular reason not to, because nothing in my own memory that afternoon connected my caution to any specific gap in the record. That connection wouldn't arrive for another 4 months, standing in a canyon that shared more with a fire from my own youth than either of us could have guessed sitting at that kitchen table. I need to go back to 1987, to explain what actually seeded the problem this story turns on, because the mistake at the center of this isn't Roz's, and it isn't EmberTrace engineering. It's mine, made 37 years before anyone had ever heard of predictive fire behavior modeling, in a decision I made as a 26-year-old incident commander that felt, at the time, like nothing more than a reasonable administrative shortcut. I was working my 3rd fire season as a junior incident commander on the Coldwater Ridge Fire, a mid-sized timber fire that, on the afternoon of September 14, 1987, did something I'd never seen a fire do before and have only seen a handful of times since, under a specific combination of downslope wind acceleration and unusually dry, fine dead fuel in a narrow canyon. The fire's crown run accelerated from roughly 40 chains per hour to well over 200 chains per hour in under 15 minutes, a rate of spread so far outside anything the standard incident reporting form of that era had fields to describe that I genuinely didn't know how to document it accurately when I sat down to file my after-action report 3 days later. I remember standing on a ridge above that canyon, radio in hand, watching the fire's front move faster than I could track it with my own eyes, and understanding, in a way I'd never understood before that afternoon, exactly how small a person's authority actually is against something moving at that scale and speed. The official incident report form, in 1987, had a maximum spread rate category, and Coldwater Ridge's actual peak spread rate exceeded it by a wide enough margin that I remember sitting with my supervisor, a good, tired man named Walt Hendricks who's been dead almost 20 years now, trying to figure out how to fill out a form that simply didn't have a box for what I'd actually watched happen. We sat in his cramped field office trailer for the better part of an hour, the ashtray between us filling slowly while he turned the form over in his hands like the answer might be printed somewhere on the back. Walt's guidance, which I followed without much argument because I was young and he'd survived more fires than I'd yet lived years, was to record it at the form's maximum category rather than leave a number the review board would flag as an obvious data entry error, on the theory that an inflated but plausible number caused less administrative confusion than an accurate one the form couldn't accommodate. I filed that report exactly the way he told me to, and I want to be honest that I didn't think about it again for decades, not because I was hiding something, but because it genuinely felt, at 26, like the kind of small bureaucratic accommodation every experienced person in this agency made routinely, the sort of decision so unremarkable I couldn't have told you, if you'd asked me a year later, that I'd made it at all. I went on to a full career built, in no small part, on exactly the kind of careful, honest documentation I'd have told any junior analyst under me was sacred to this work, never once connecting that principle back to the one afternoon, early in my career, where I'd quietly set it aside at a trusted supervisor's suggestion. What I didn't understand, filling out that form in 1987, was that Coldwater Ridge wasn't a unique anomaly. It was one of a small but real category of extreme wind-driven crown fire runs that occurs, rarely, under a specific combination of conditions, and because I'd recorded mine, and at least 2 other analysts across the following decades had likely done something similar with their own reports of extreme events the forms of their eras also couldn't fully capture. The historical dataset Embertrace was eventually trained on contained a systematic, invisible undercounting of exactly how fast a fire can move under that rare combination of conditions. The fire that exposed this, 37 years after Coldwater Ridge, started from a lightning strike on a Tuesday afternoon in August, in terrain roughly 40 miles from where I'd stood as a 26-year-old watching a fire outrun a reporting form's imagination. The community of Palisade Junction, a town of just under 3,000 people, sat 6 miles downslope from the ignition point, connected to the outside world by a single 2-lane evacuation route that wound through the same kind of narrow canyon terrain that had produced Coldwater Ridge's extreme run decades earlier. I'd driven that particular stretch of road dozens of times over the years, mostly on the way to other incidents further north, and I remember thinking, on more than one of those drives, long before this story began, that the canyon had a certain shape to it that reminded me uncomfortably of somewhere else, without ever quite letting myself finish that thought. Embertrace initial spread projections, generated within the first 2 hours of the incident, forecast a manageable, gradual rate of advance toward Palisade Junction, estimating the fire wouldn't reach the community's outer boundary for approximately 18 hours, a timeline that gave Incident Command what appeared to be a comfortable margin for a standard, unhurried evacuation notice rather than an immediate mandatory order. The initial incident briefing I attended that evening had the relaxed, procedural tone of a fire everyone expected to manage well within normal parameters, coffee passed around, map spread across a folding table, nobody in that tent yet aware of the particular shape the following afternoon's weather was about to take. Was called out to the incident that evening, not as the lead analyst, but as a senior consulting advisor, a role I'd taken on in semi-retirement over the previous few years specifically for incidents involving terrain I had deep personal familiarity with. Standing at the Incident Command post that evening, reviewing the weather forecast for the following afternoon, a forecast calling for the exact combination of downslope wind acceleration and single-digit relative humidity that had driven Coldwater Ridge's extreme run in 1987, I felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as a very old, very specific kind of dread. The same physical sensation I remembered from standing on that ridge above Coldwater Ridge decades earlier. Arriving now in a canyon I'd driven past 100 times without ever fully letting myself see what it actually resembled. Ember Trace has this at 18 hours to Palisades boundary, the incident commander told me, a capable woman named Sarah Delacroix I'd worked with on a dozen prior incidents, someone whose judgment I trusted enough that disagreeing with her carried real weight for me, in both directions. That gives us a solid window for a phased evacuation starting at first light tomorrow. I don't think 18 hours is right, Sarah. I watched a fire do something in this exact kind of terrain, under almost this exact wind forecast, back in '87. It went from a normal crown run to something I've never fully been able to describe accurately, in about 15 minutes. Ember Trace model is drawing on 40 years of incident data for terrain and fuel conditions almost identical to this, Des. If an event like what you're describing had happened before, it would be reflected in the training data. I stood there for a long moment, doing an arithmetic I hadn't done in decades, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically uncomfortable, exactly why it might not be reflected, because I was very possibly the person who'd failed to record it accurately, 37 years earlier, at a kitchen table request from a supervisor who'd been trying to help a scared young commander fill out a form that didn't have room for the truth. I called Roz that night, past 11, and told her about Coldwater Ridge, the whole story, the maximum category workaround, Walt Hendrix's well-intentioned advice, 37 years of never once connecting that old decision to anything that mattered until a wind forecast in front of me made the connection impossible to avoid. I could hear, in the long silence after I finished talking, that she understood immediately what I was actually telling her, underneath the historical detail, that the uncle who'd spent her whole life modeling exactly the kind of careful documentation this profession depended on had, once, a very long time ago, quietly failed to live up to that standard himself. You think your own report from 1987 is part of what's making Ember Trace underestimate this fire's potential spread rate? I think it's possible enough that I'm not willing to bet Palisade Junction's evacuation timeline on the assumption that it isn't. I can't prove it from memory alone, Roz. I can only tell you what I watched happen once, in terrain like this, under weather like this, and that the number I filed afterward wasn't the real number. Roz didn't argue with me, and I've thought since about how much easier that conversation would have been if she had, if I could tell this story with some version of her insisting the model was right and me insisting my memory outranked it. What she did instead, working through the night from her own laptop while I stayed at the incident command post, was pull every historical incident report in the region flagged at the reporting form's maximum spread rate category across the full 40-year dataset, cross-referencing them against wind and humidity conditions, looking specifically for a cluster of reports that might represent exactly the kind of systematic undercounting I was describing. I sat in a folding chair outside the command tent for most of that night, watching the glow of distant flame on the ridgeline while my niece, 200 miles away, quietly tested whether an old man's memory and an old man's guilt were actually the same thing, or something closer to real evidence. She found 11 reports, across 4 decades, all filed at or near the maximum category, all under similar downslope wind and low humidity conditions, all in narrow canyon terrain comparable to what sat between the Palisade fire and the town's 6 miles downslope. 11 data points isn't a large sample, but it was enough, combined with my direct account of what actually happened at Coldwater Ridge, to convince Sarah Delacroix that Ember Trace's 18-hour projection carried more uncertainty than its confidence interval suggested. Sarah ordered an immediate mandatory evacuation of Palisade Junction at 6 a.m. the following morning, 12 hours ahead of what Ember Trace's original projection would have supported, citing the historical pattern Roz had identified and my direct account of Coldwater Ridge as the basis for accelerating the timeline beyond what the model alone recommended. It was not, by her own later account, an easy call to make on the basis of one analyst's decades-old memory and 11 ambiguous historical records, and I've never forgotten the particular steadiness in her voice when she gave the order over the radio that morning, a steadiness I recognized because I'd tried to carry the same tone myself, once, on a ridge above Coldwater Ridge, 37 years earlier. The forecasted wind event arrived at 2 p.m. that afternoon, nearly identical to the conditions I remembered from 1987, the same particular quality of heat and stillness giving way, within the space of a few minutes, to a downslope gust I felt against my own face at the command post nearly 40 miles from the fire itself. The fire's crown run accelerated exactly the way I'd described to Sarah the night before, covering the distance to what would have been Palisade Junction's outer boundary in just under 2 hours rather than the 18 Ember Trace initial model had projected, a rate of spread that, had the evacuation still been in its earlier, unhurried phase, would very likely have caught a meaningful portion of the town's population still on the single evacuation route through canyon terrain offering no safe pull-off points. Because the evacuation had already been completed by the time the extreme run began, Palisade Junction's nearly 3,000 residents were clear of the danger zone with hours to spare. The fire ultimately burned to within a half-mile of the town's boundary before a wind shift and a well-positioned containment line halted its advance, close enough that the outcome could easily have gone very differently on a slightly different afternoon. I filed a formal correction to my 1987 Coldwater Ridge incident report the following week, 37 years after the original, documenting as precisely as memory and the surviving weather data from that period allowed, what I actually believed the fire's peak spread rate had been that afternoon. It's an unusual document, procedurally, an old man correcting his own decades-old paperwork based on nothing but memory and a near miss it took nearly 4 decades to expose, and I understand if some reviewing this record someday finds that basis less than fully satisfying as a matter of pure data integrity. I sat with that document longer than I've sat with almost anything I've written in this career, aware the entire time that I was putting into a permanent federal record an admission that could, in a different regulatory climate, have carried real professional consequence for a decision made by a frightened 26-year-old nearly 4 decades earlier, guided by a supervisor who was no longer alive to share in whatever accountability the record might eventually assign. Roz spent the following winter, alongside 2 other analysts, conducting a systematic review of every maximum category historical incident report in the regional dataset, working to identify how many others might carry a similar undocumented undercounting bias from reporting forms that, across decades, simply hadn't had room for the truth of what various young commanders, in various canyons, had actually watched a fire do. She found 6 more likely candidates beyond my own, incidents where retired analysts, contacted directly, offered testimony similar to mine, a pattern of old bureaucratic accommodation quietly shaping a modern predictive system in ways nobody who built that system could have anticipated without going back, decades later, to ask the people who'd lived through the fires the forms couldn't fully describe. She told me, once, that the hardest part of that winter wasn't the technical work of retraining the model. It was the phone calls to men and women in their 70s and 80s, some of them clearly relieved to finally say out loud what they'd carried quietly for decades, and at least one who hung up on her twice before finally agreeing to talk. I still consult on incidents in terrain I know well, less often now than a few years ago, but often enough to keep testing whether the specific, hard-won recognition in my own memory still has something to offer a system that, however sophisticated, can only ever know what the record actually contains. Roz and I talk most weeks now, about Ember Trace ongoing refinement, about the 11, now 17, historical incidents her review eventually surfaced, about the strange, humbling experience of discovering that the blind spot in a system built to protect people from fire had been sitting, unexamined, in my own handwriting since before she was born. She sent me, this past spring, a printout of the retrained model's updated confidence interval for extreme wind-driven runs in canyon terrain like Palisades, the numbers now carrying an honesty they hadn't carried in 40 years, and I keep that printout folded in my truck's glove compartment, next to a photograph of Coldwater Ridge taken the morning after the fire finally burned itself out in 1987. Fire still doesn't read a probability model, and it never will, however good the model eventually becomes. What I've learned, in the year since Palisade Junction, is that a model is only ever as honest as the people who lived through the fires it learned from were willing, or able, to be, and that sometimes the most important correction a system needs isn't better engineering at all. It's an old man finally telling the truth about a form he filled out wrong, decades before he understood exactly what that single, unremarkable shortcut would eventually cost, or nearly cost, a town he'd never even heard of yet.